Welcome to Phoenixmasonry Live, a show that brings you talented Freemasons, Masonic authors, artists, craftsmen, and brothers of accomplishment. I am Frederic L. Milliken, Executive Director of Phoenixmasonry, and we are here to celebrate our Freemasonry. That's what we do at Phoenixmasonry. We celebrate our Freemasonry. And I'm here today celebrating with the setting Maul Study Circle, headed by Jason McKean out of Fellowship Lodge in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Welcome, brethren. How are you all doing?
Fred.
All right. You all doing good. Well, that's great. I understand you've had a monsoon season up there, so a little light tonight, but we're going to proceed with the paper that I wrote on Native American rituals and the influence of Freemasonry. And I wrote this paper in 2005 in preparation for a speaking tour of Alberta, Canada. And they flew me and my wife up, all expenses paid, and boarded us. I spoke at a number of lodges with this paper. I have since added an epilogue to it, which makes it even more interesting. There's some background information before we get into the nitty-gritty. I will keep it to a minimum, but one of the things to point out is that Native Americans did not write down anything. In fact, it was not until 1920 that written records were kept by Indians. That is probably only due to the homogenization into general society. Everything was passed down by word of mouth. Sound familiar? The other thing to emphasize as we proceed forward is that whatever we do in the number 3, they do in the number 4. So the number 3 is kind of sacred to us in Freemasonry, and the number 4 is sacred to the Native American Indian. So when we march around the lodge, circumambulation 3 times, they go around 4 times. When we have 3 principal officers, they have 4 principal officers. When we have 3 degrees, they have 4 degrees. So the number 4 is very, very important. Now, to the Native American, heaven was the happy hunting ground. The Dakotas believed that the east symbolized life. They laid a dead body east and west. Think, how shall we bury the body? In the track of the sun, so that it may rise again. Several Indian secret societies acted out the death and rebirth of the candidate, as we shall soon see. In the ghost dance of the 1850s, popular among the Paiute, Shoshone, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Caddo, and Pawnee, the candidate dies and falls unconscious to the ground. A circle of brothers form around him, chanting and singing. The dead man is brought back to life. Native Americans were big on brotherhood. It was a common practice for an Indian male to take a partner or brother. Such pairs often met in associations, which were in all reality fraternities. Indians believed strongly in the universal kingship of all created beings. In regards to morality, the practice of virtue was a must. An Indian was taught to recognize his dependence on his maker and to never enter upon any great or important undertaking without first thanking the maker for the strength that gave him power to perform the deed willed. That should sound familiar to a Freemason. In regards to symbolism, in the estufa or lodge room of the Moki Indians on the east wall was a prayer to God, to Omeya, with black and white stripes symbolizing rain and red and blue lightning. As Masons in this place, we would find the letter G. To the Dakotas, a white horse and blanket were emblems of purity and badges of the Holy Lodge Society. The lodge taught the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Doesn't that sound familiar? The lodge taught, yep, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Yeah, I already said that. When the Dakotas met a brother, they placed the hand on the heart and said, "Oh ho ah ta shanta wash ta lo," or "Good morning, Father. My heart is glad." They held.
I'm not going to ask you that.
What is that? A little bit of an echo. Oh boy. Okay, so when the Dakotas met a brother, they placed the hand on the heart and said, "Oh ho ah ta shanta wash ta lo," or "Good morning, Father. My heart is glad." They held.
I was speaking more than echo on my end, but I got a question for you if I could jump right in.
Yep.
Jason McKean, Master of Fellowship Lodge. First of all, thank you for having us. I'm the only person, I've been elected the only one pretty enough to be on camera, but there's about 12 guys here drying off. But I had a question. Were these society-wide groups, or was this more of like a warriors lodge, a group of men? Like, were these Indian lodges, what were they made up of? Who were they made up of?
Mostly men. There were some that had women also, and we go over briefly some of the ones that don't enter upon the main discussion, just to show that there were many different ones. But most of them were brotherhood lodges. They weren't war lodges, and it was a way to. Some of them also were medicine lodges, where those involved would become medicine men or shamans, and the frequency of these lodges was all throughout, in so many different tribes, but they were pretty well scattered among a lot of tribes, and most of them were brotherhood lodges, like our Masonic fraternity.
And I believe you mentioned before they go back quite a few years longer than Freemasonry, right? At least several hundred years longer than our records of Masonry, right?
Only one that I know of. Only one, and that's where we'll spend a lot of time on.
I'm jumping the gun.
Yeah, but we're not near there yet, because we're going to go through some that probably did borrow from Freemasonry and borrowed from the white man. But we're going to get to the one that didn't. I promise you. Getting back to the Dakotas, they held their secret council in the hills, and a Tyler was mounted on a white horse and clothed in a white blanket. Now, the Karankawa shaman of southern Texas wore circular sun discs with a circle and a triangle inside. Its symbolism, like many ancient Native American customs, passed down by word, but held by a few who suddenly died without passing on the meaning, was lost. But it was given a new meaning and reinterpreted as the tent of faithful pitched in the sun. Coasoti and Kichi tribes associated it with a brotherhood badge. To many others, the triangle was a symbol of immortality in their secret brotherhoods. So you see, these are mostly brotherhoods. The Ojibwe of Lake Superior, the members of their brotherhood, wore a small badge of cloth adorned with wampum and surrounded by fringed feathers. The face was a finger pointing to a long road, emblematical of a future life of instruction. This badge was worn on the flesh of the breast. It was the Indian's diploma. Now, regarding sacred and secret words, this is rather important. They were plentiful and many, but over time, most had lost their meanings. Unfortunately, this is a drawback to having everything, every single thing, passed down mouth to ear. The Iroquois called the Great Spirit Yowah, Y-O-W-A-H. Contrast that with Yahweh. This tribe, in a festival, perambulated around their lodge room, and at each full course of the sun, they stopped in the east, where three oldest chiefs were seated. Each time around, certain questions were asked and answers given. The procession was 9 men. Okay, now we're going to get into in detail, two ritualistic Indian societies. The first was the LOTAGOTMP, or Legends of the Ancient Guards of the Mystic Potents, also known as Little Waters. Thank God somebody shortened it. The ceremony was held in a long house of the Iroquois. That is the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, or Mohawk. Here, due to space and time, we will cover just the high points of the ceremony. The proceedings began with 4 raps at the door. Remember, everything is 4. The candidate was brought in and listened to the story of Red Hand, the ancient leader. As in the Hiramic legend, the candidate assumes the identity of the object of the story. Red Hand was a young chief who received certain mysterious knowledge from the creator of all. He was kind and generous and loved by all. One day in a battle, a poisoned arrow felled him. The enemy Indian rushed upon him, demanding the secret of his power. Think Hiram Abiff. Or his life, the secret of his power or his life. Red Hand refused to divulge the secret, so he was scalped. A lone wolf came upon the body and howled so loud he brought all the animals from the forest. They each contributed a part of their bodies and revived the scalp, which they put on Red Hand's head. They formed a circle around him as signs of life and chanted. Red Hand listened with his eyes closed when a voice asked him these questions. Voice, hast thou cleansed thyself from human guilt and impurity? Red Hand, I have. Voice, hast thou ill will toward any of thy fellow creatures? Red Hand, I have not. Voice, wilt thou trust and obey us, keeping thyself always chaste and valorous? Red Hand, I will. Voice, wilt thou hold this power through which we endow thee for thine own chosen company only? Red Hand, I will. Voice, will thou endure death or torture in its cause? Red Hand, I will. Voice, will thou view this secret never to be revealed, save at thy death hour? Red Hand, I will. Voice, the death hour will be revealed to thee. Thou will be allowed to choose thy successor, and at the end of thy journey thou will be rewarded for faith and obedience. The circle drew closer, and the brother who is the bear touched the breast of Red Hand. All stood erect. The bear grasped the hand of the leader who was to be raised, though slain, and by a strong grip pulled Red Hand to his feet. And that is society number 1. Little Waters. Now we get to the main event. And the main event here is the Grand Medicine Lodge, or the Mediweewin Society. And this one we are going to spend some time on. It was more widespread than Little Waters and was practiced by the Algonquin tribes, Massachusetts, Narragansett, Pequots, Powhatans, Delawares, Shawnees, Saw, Fox, Menominee, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Ojibwa, Chippewa, Cree, and as we're going to see, a lot of others too. This was a popular secret society. The degrees differed slightly from tribe to tribe, naturally. There are 4 distinct degrees. Remember, we're back to the number 4 again. Although many believe that those degrees beyond the first were very repetitious. What is lost to us that has not been handed down is the actual content of the lectures, which comes after the initiation ceremony, but is part of the degree, just like our Freemasonry. What we do know most about is the initiation ceremony, roughly equivalent to our first section of the Masonic degree, 3rd degree. The candidate must be prepared to offer many gifts to those who will perform the ceremony for him. He must take an instructor or preceptor to prepare him for such a major step. The Longhouse, or Mediweegan, or Mediweegiwam, or Grand Medicine Lodge, was oblong, measuring 120 feet by 20 feet. And it was situated east and west in a clearing. 4-foot openings were placed in the east and west, providing entrances and exits. On the 4 corners outside were planted cedar or pine trees. On the 4 corners outside, about 100 yards from the east entrance was placed a wigwam or sweat lodge. In some longhouses, in place of a wigwam, there is an anteroom separated by a partition. Whatever the case may be, it is here that the candidate takes sweat baths to purify himself. And it is here that the preceptor or oldster, think past master, instructs the candidate. This is done on 4 successive days. We're back to number 4 again. 4 days of learning ritual, 4 days of vapor baths. Here the candidate receives the secrets of the medicine lodge, rules of the fraternity, health, immortality, and supernatural powers. Inside the lodge, there are at the east and west entrances walls creating short hallways. About 10 feet in from the east entrance is a large flat stone of over 1 foot in diameter, and it's placed in the ground. This is for all extensive purposes an altar. About 10 feet in from the west entrance is placed a sacred midi post of cedar. For the first degree, it is about 7 feet high and 6 to 8 inches thick. It is painted red with a band of green 4 inches from the top. In subsequent degrees, another midi post is added. Halfway between the stone and the post is placed a blanket where the presents are placed. To start the ceremony, all the priest, preceptor, and candidate holding his presents line up at the door. all the priests file in and take their stations, except for one who stays at the door with the preceptor and candidate. Then, with the preceptor on one side of him and the priest remaining at the door on the other side of him, the candidate is marched around the outside of the lodge room 4 times, stopping at and facing the east entrance, where he places his presence on the ground and says, and the candidate is prompted to say, "Let me come in, and these I put down, my gifts." The preceptor goes inside and deposits the presents on the blanket, while the priest at the candidate's side sings a chant to the Great Spirit. Then the preceptor leads the candidate inside while all stand. He is led along the south side to the west and around paths to the north and back to the east. This circumambulation is repeated 4 times. As he first starts out, the member nearest the east falls in behind the candidate, and so forth all around the lodge until the entire assembly is marching. Are you getting some negative feedback, or is everything okay?
Everything sounds good on our end. But can I jump into the question while we're paused?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Then I can stop talking for a minute.
Actually, 2 questions. I'll do 2 for 1 because our brother just handed me a note. The first one is that for the Little Waters Laws, the Rivers Laws, the first one we spoke on. I'm amazed how closely that mirrors aspects of the myth of Osiris. And it just strikes me that all across the world we have these universal creation myths that have kind of that sew us all together beyond our fraternity and Freemasonry.
That's the discussion for after the paper. That's what I want you to talk about at the end.
But then we'll go to the other brother's question. Is it sounds like by the way you're speaking that these ceremonies are no longer practiced; they've died out. Do we have any evidence of as folks are back to rediscover their native cultures in the 60s and 70s? Was there any attempt to return to some of these ceremonies in the modern day?
There is no indication that these ceremonies are not still practiced, as far as I know. Okay, and where were we? On the members were all dropping in line behind the candidate. Yes, but I will repeat it. But as he first starts out, the member nearest the east falls in behind the candidate, and so forth, all around the lodge until the entire assembly is marching. On the 4th pass, all the members begin to drop off in reverse order of their hopping on. I hope some of this sounds familiar. The candidate has returned to the east with the preceptor at his side. The 4 officiating priests, notice, we have 3, they have 4, position themselves in a semicircle in the west at the post, facing west, and the candidate is conducted to them, facing them, and the east. The preceptor places himself a few steps back and to one side of the candidate and calls on an assistant to do the same on the other side. The preceptor says, "The time has now arrived that I yielded to you, the midi megis." Now this is important. The midi megis that will give you life. We'll explain it as we go, but this is the aspect that makes this ceremony kind of unique, because right now we're talking about a seashell, the midi megis. Okay? The chief priest sings a song, and the candidate is asked to kneel, blankets having been set there for that purpose. The 4th priest says, "Now is the time that I hope of you that you shall take life, the bead, the megi shell." You see, each officiating priest holds an otter skin or midi sac containing healing herbs in a small shell or cypromonita, containing the essence of all the virtues of the medicines of the otter skin. The first officiating priest then holds the midi sac in his left hand, extended as if he was holding a gun, while with his right hand he holds the bottom. He then thrusts it at the candidate's left breast, saying, "Yah ho, 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 ho." He repeats this maneuver 3 times, and on the last thrust, he makes a motion as if he was shooting the candidate. Meanwhile, the preceptor and his assistant place their hands on the candidate's shoulders and cause him to shake. The second and third officiating priests repeat the same ritual. Now, the fourth and chief priest also repeats the same maneuvers, except at the fourth pass, he shoots the candidate in the head, felling him lifeless. The purpose here is to shoot the mijis into the candidate and then have it appear in his mouth. The 4 priests place their midi sacs on the candidate's back, and after a few moments, a miji shell drops from his mouth, where he had been previously instructed to retain it. The chief priest picks up the miji, holding it between the thumb and index finger of the right hand, extending his arm toward the candidate's mouth, says, "Wah, wah, he, he." The same words are repeated, as while the miji is held toward the east, then to the south, west, north, and finally to the sky. The candidate, coming somewhat to life, immediately has the miji then thrust back into his mouth, and he falls lifeless once again. Now the 4 priests take their midi sacs and circle around the candidate, touching his body with their sacs, tempting to raise him. The chief priest then commands him to rise, and the candidate comes to his feet, whereupon he has sung a song, and he sings a song in return. This concludes the formal part of the ceremony. Then the informal part commences. The peace pipe is passed, with offerings of smoke to the east, south, west, north, then up to the heavens, and then down to the earth. The candidate is presented with his brand new midi sac. He then tries out his new powers on the rest of the assembly. Afterwards, presents are distributed, followed by a giant banquet, a feast. Such is the first degree, with each succeeding degree a little greater manifestation of essentially the same thing. The Midi-Wewen Society has many songs. Here are some titles of songs: Escorting the Candidate, I Am Raising Him Up, We Are Now to Receive Your Midi Brother, You Are Going Around the Midi Lodge, think circumambulation, Whence I Come, think Whence Came You, My Brother, Toward the East, I Will Bring It Up to Light, Beautiful as a Star, Hanging in the Sky is Our Lodge, think Starry-Decked Heaven. Okay, a brief word about the Mancani Society. The Winnebagos performed a Mancani ceremony or medicine dance. It was held for both men and women. This is one of the few that I've seen where the women are involved. The ceremony was performed in a long tent where candidates were perambulated between 5 stations representing the road of life. Here they received the esoteric teaching from their conductor while negotiating that rough and rugged road. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. as reciting the ceremony, you know, you might say, well, that's somewhat like Freemasonry, but it's not really like Freemasonry. So let's look at some comparisons here and see if it makes a little more sense. Let us look at some areas of commonality in the ceremonies of the Mmidi-Gwin̄win only. The candidate pauses at the entrance and is prompted to say, "Let me come in and put down my gifts." Thus, he has demonstrated that his admission is of his own free will and accord. He is told that he is embarking on a new life and to take it seriously and to guard well the secrets of the grand medicine. Do we not tell our Masonic candidates pretty much the same thing? One item we did not discuss is that invitation to the Mmidi-Gwin̄win ceremonies is sent out via a twig or stick presented to the invitee, who deposits that inside the door of the lodge when he enters. This is in reality a summons, just like a Masonic summons. Attendance of the invited is considered mandatory. Is that not how Masonry used to be and still is in some foreign lands? Another item we did not talk about is that those who perform the ceremony have birch bark charts. These correspond to our tracing. The candidate is prepared in a separate room or place outside or attached to the lodge room, as in Freemasonry. The Native American never presents his back to the sacred stone or altar. Do we not have similar rules in navigating the Masonic altar? Upon being raised, upon raising the candidate, note that none of the officiating priests can raise the body except the chief priest. In Freemasonry, only the third try and only the worshipful master can accomplish this task. Upon completion of the degree, the candidate is presented a brand new midi sack, which he proudly wears. In Freemasonry, we present the candidate an apron. In Mmidi-Gwin̄win, there is a certain time between the degrees, often a year, and in between the candidate must choose an instructor to teach him and certify him before he goes on to the next degree. And we in Freemasonry do likewise. And most importantly, there is much that is lost in these degrees. As the guardians of the secrets failed to see to it that the passing down of the ancient truths were not interrupted. Just as Hiram Abiff had the word and now it is lost, so did the Mmidi-Gwin̄win have many words that have now lost meaning. And to get off lecturing for a minute, this is one of the aspects that dates this particular degree, because when the candidate is in the sweat lodge or the anteroom and he's being instructed, he is saying or memorizing words of which he and his instructor have no idea what they mean. And the reason they have no idea what they mean is by word of mouth, somebody has interrupted the meanings being conveyed and they have lost their meaning. You know, I look at that and I say, to get off lecturing for a minute, we have such words in our ritual, but we know the meanings to them, but we don't use them anymore. I mean, I've never met anybody in civil society that uses the word cowan or eavesdropper. And when we say I hail, I conceal, the word hail, I don't think anybody in civil society really knows the meaning that we put to it in Freemasonry. They're old English words. They're out of style. They're no longer used in common parlance. This is what happened to the Indians. Their ancient ceremonies used certain words, and the words eventually lost their meanings as language progressed, and language is always changing. And as language changed, somebody forgot to pass down what the meanings of the words were. So you have this candidate out in the sweat lodge doing words that he has no idea what they mean, but he knows that they're part of the sacred ceremony, so he's got to repeat them and memorize them. That is one way you can date it. And I think I say that in here. I think I say that in here somewhere. Okay, so let's go on to make some mini conclusions here before we get into a discussion of major conclusions. The ghost dance of the 1850s was a distinct imitation of Freemasonry because of the fact we have given it a scant coverage. Because of that fact, we have given it a scant coverage here. Dennis Cherenke says this about Little Waters. Remember Red Hand? In the case of Red Hand and his scalping, it should also be considered that scalping was not practiced in North America prior to the event of Europeans. So, that particular ceremony borrowed from the white man. The bear claw is just too similar to the lion's paw not to be a copycat. So we can say that Little Waters could have been corrupted by Freemasonry or civil society of Europeans. A similar case can be made for the Mancani Society and many other Indian ceremonies of fraternities not mentioned here. At this point, it looks like we say there's no Indian Freemasonry. But, and here's the but the Mediweewin ceremony presents a very different conclusion, which is why we have spent so much time on it. A factual case can be made that this ceremony was in place long before the white man set foot on North American shore. First, the ritual contains certain words or figures of speech which have never been used in usual public discourse of Indians since the white man came. In fact, the 4 days spent in a wigwam sweat lodge was one of learning ritual or words that were totally unfamiliar to the Indian of that day. One of the ways to date a ceremony such as this is to see if modern or ancient vernacular was used. We use a lot of ancient vernacular in our ritual. In the case of the use of much archaic, venerable terminology, we are shown that the ceremony dates back to a much more ancient time. Secondly, the sacred Miji shell, the Cypre moneta, used by the Mediweewin, have been found in various North American earth mounds, lost and buried long before the first known white contact. Since they only grow in the South Pacific, Western Africa, and perhaps a big stretch, occasionally found in Central America. Their prevalence in pre-contact days, that is before the white man, is one of those mysteries that is difficult to explain. It is known that these same shells, the Cypre moneta, have been immediately valued and desired by nearly every so-called primitive people when introduced by traders. It is as if every tribal people recognized something very special about the certain shell. Other cowries, or shells, are larger, more colorful, and are liked for their ornamental value. But Cypress moneta, the Miji shell, is revered. So at this point, I can say that we definitely have some kind of Indian Freemasonry. Now, I wrote an epilogue to this. And once we're through with the epilogue, we're going to have a discussion, right?
Of course.
Paper was written in 2005, and I did the epilogue in 2017, at the end of 2017, so it was around December, just before the turn of the year. Since publication of Native American rituals and the influence of Freemasonry some 12 years ago, new scholarship has been discovered on the Midiwiwin or Grand Medicine Society. From independent sources, we can trace the movement and societies of a class of Native Americans called the Anishinaabe. Boy, some of these words are hard. This group of common ancestors consisted of the Algonquin, Odawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Chippewa, Saulteaux, Oji-Cree, Nipissing, and Mississaugas tribes, indigenous to the Great Lakes region, from New York to Minnesota, and both what is now Canada and the United States. The Anishinaabe had three different medicine or lodge societies. The first was the Midiwiwin, which we have expounded on at length already. The second was the Wabanowin, or Dawn Society, sometimes misnamed the Magical Dawn Society. They are often referred to as secretive, mystical visionaries. Driven underground by the white man, little is known of their ceremonies except the fire dance. Recently re-emerging in the public eye, they have practicing lodges in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. Third, the Jisakiwin Society, or the Shaking Tent, or Juggler's Tent. Those fully vested with all the rights and degrees of this society were highly regarded spiritual leaders. Now here's where it gets interesting. Historian Walter James Hoffman, who published annual reports for the U.S. Government Bureau of American Ethnology, which was established by the Smithsonian Institute and operated from 1881 through 1933, traced the migration of the Anishinaabe Native Americans. He was able to get inside the almost impenetrable Native American secrecy by gaining the confidence of one William Whipple Warren, who was half Indian. Warren's mother was an Ojibwa, born in La Pointe, Michigan. Warren's account of the Anishinaabe journey was handed down from generation to generation, from mouth to ear. According to this story, the Anishinaabe followed a sacred Negus shell, whose vision guided them westward, with numerous stops on the way. This long trek took generations. Warren says that they began their migration around 950 AD at the Great Salt Water, which may have been the Atlantic Ocean by the Gulf of St. Lawrence. According to the legend, they traveled down the St. Lawrence to Montreal, but then they moved westward to the outlet of Lake Superior and Sault Ste. Marie, remaining for a long time. Finally, La Pointe Island, where they settled, making the wild rice waters of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and Madeline Island, the island of the yellow shafted flicker, their final resting place. While traveling, the Midiwi Lodge, or Midiwigan, was pulled down and not erected until a permanent place of settlement was chosen. This resettlement consisted of, over a period of time, means that this was done many times over, as they would travel, make this travel over generations, over centuries to complete all this. So as they were going from day to day, they did not have the lodge open. And even if they stopped for a period of a week or something. But oftentimes, as they traveled down to like Montreal, they would pause there and maybe stay a year or two or three. Then they would open the lodge. And then they would move on, and they would travel down and maybe hit what we call Toronto or Niagara. And on the way, the lodge would not be open, but they would settle there and stay there, maybe 20 or 30 years. Who knows? The lodge would be open. Okay. While traveling, immediately along the way, some of the tribes split off and stayed put. The Potawatomi and the Ottawa stayed at Sault Ste. Marie. They didn't go on more than that. Hoffman reports also a cultural divergence separating the Potawatomi from the Ojibwe and Ottawa. Particularly the Potawatomi did not adopt the agricultural innovations discovered or adopted by the Ojibwe, such as the Three Sisters crop complex, copper tools, conjugal collaborative farming, and the use of canoes in rice harvest. The Potawatomi also developed labor according to gender, much more than the Ojibwe and the Ottawa did. The history of migration offers us much light into the controversy of whether the Mediwiwin ceremonies were given to the Native Americans by European trappers and settlers, or whether they were developed this set of degrees wholly on their own. And I have scholarship, which will, and you know, writers much more well-known and established than I am, that will tell you that this was a borrowed from the white man society. I don't think so. I stand in opposition to that. I hope we have decided the issue now, because this migration of the Anishinaabe tribes started in 950 AD. That's before the year 1000, and it took 5 centuries to accomplish. In each place of settlement, the Mediwiwin Lodge was opened, and the ceremonies that mirrored Freemasonry were practiced. One last paragraph. William Whipple Warren got this history from an old chief who had received it by word of mouth, passed down for generations. Warren then passed the story on to Hoffman, and we are passing it on to you. In parting, we wish to quote the words of that old Native American chief who spoke to Warren, who said, quote, "Still, the Ojibways moved westward, and for the last time, the Mediwi Lodge was erected on the island of La Pointe. And here, long before the pale-faced appeared among them, it was practiced in its purest and most original form." And that, my brothers, is the end of that paper. And I hope it's been enlightening. But we have only touched the surface of what the ramifications of this are. And now is the time that the setting Maul needs to do what it always does and discuss. So, you know, one of the things that to think about, and you might want to comment on, is the shell. This, you know, this particular shell, I mean, we're talking about Indian tribes that existed in the Great Lakes region and the St. Lawrence Seaway, both on the Canada and American side, which wasn't differentiated in those days. And they started somewhere up at the entrance of the St. Lawrence River, way up there, you know, probably opposite Newfoundland, and ended up in Wisconsin, Minnesota. So how are these people getting a shell that's basically Polynesian or Asian African all the way up there? And why isn't the shell found in Florida or Texas or Arizona or California? None of the shell I have heard have ever found that shell there. But they're finding it up north where there's snow and ice and everything else. And it's basically, like I say, a Polynesian shell. I don't have an answer to that. But doesn't that seem a little something of a mystery?
Well, I'm struck by how you said before that in all these cultures in Polynesia and Africa, all through the Americas, the shell is recognized. I know the first thing I do when I'm going to get home is I Google the shell. And on settingmaul.com, we'll have we'll pull a write-up on that shell for you in a picture. But it's the fact that it speaks to something in all of us, like I alluded to a little bit earlier with Osiris and his raising, it's more than a coincidence, I believe, that these ceremonies share so much in common and are recognized by so many different groups, the world and centuries apart.
Right. I understand. And what might be the ramifications or the conclusions that we can draw from a ceremony that somewhat mirrors Freemasonry, developed wholly independently? How, why, and for what reason?
Well, one would assume, especially in these tribes that are very mobile. Everybody else is being quiet today, so I have to volunteer the note cards. One would assume that this brotherhood of men and society of brothers is even more important. When you're constantly moving, you have all you have is the tribe. You don't have a home. If you're traveling, like you said, perhaps the vast majority of the year, all you have is your stories and each other and the legends that you carry in your heart.
And, you know, I'll add, you know, you mentioned that they developed these independently, but, you know, my conclusion is that they didn't.
Okay.
I just think it's too much of a coincidence. And even I was thinking along the lines of Jesus that, you know, these folks moved around. So, you know, who knows what they picked up in traveling around.
But remember that this particular ceremony was up and running, and who knows how much earlier, but we know of in 950 AD. How many Europeans were in the United States and Canada at that time? I don't think very many. You know? Do you think they ran into some of the Sinclair house from Scotland? You know, you might surmise that, but as far as the Englishmen and whatever, French trappers, I don't think they would hear that. Not that early. In my take on this subject, so let me give you my take, and that might spur some more discussion, is that there is a certain basic group or philosophy of life that exists separately over the globe, and that has further ramifications. Because, I mean, you can go back to some of the ancient mysteries, and, you know, and I was looking at some of these the other day. The Druids, the ritual of the Mithras, not the Gnostics, the mysteries of Asahapi, or the Greeks called it Serapis, or Dinic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, the Bacchic and Dionysian rites, the schools of Pythagoras, the Oracle at Delphi, Osiris, Isis, Hermes Trismegistus, the Essenes, Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians. I mean, all of these things are trying to keep alive a certain thought on how men and women should exist in society and what rights and privileges they have, which are God-given, that can't be taken away from them, I think. And for that to occur, for me, it seems to me, and that's only my opinion, now, this is fact, it's just my opinion, that they're divinely inspired. Because, see, any one of us can be a Hitler. We all have free will. We can certainly make a mess of things, and we can trample on our fellow human beings something terribly. Just go to Venezuela or North Korea, and you can witness it. But maybe the grand architect of the universe wants to see preserved a certain ideology or way of life or freedoms and the worth of the individual and rights of man, and has developed similar societies that preach and educate some members of society that this is the proper way that society should exist, even though we have a lot of people that fall into the evil trap. Now, there again, it's only my opinion. Perhaps that would spur some more comment.
Well, I think that may have been what Brother Nelson was alluding to, was that there, why the profane might see it as a common culture or this Atlantean theory. I think Masons know better that there's certainly this divine spark that these rituals may have evolved from, and maybe it's the thumbprint of the divine that manifests itself within the boundaries of all these cultures. Why a certain group of Frenchmen in 1250 might experience it in a certain way on a horse and a sword and a temple in the desert. Others may, with a red man being scalped in the plains of Wisconsin.
Right. Right. Somebody else?
I mean, pass notes. They don't want to speak.
Oh, they want to speak. They're passing you notes. Okay, well, let's have the notes.
Now, besides word of mouth, do any of the historical items identify the timeline of events? Do we have carbon dating? Do we have artifacts attached to some of these rituals?
No, you're not, because Native Americans are very secretive. You know, there's actually a Native American church, and I had the pleasure of going to, since moved here to Texas, of going up to Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and meeting with the head of the Oklahoma Native American Indian degree team. And there is a degree team, and they dress in Native American dress. And we had a long talk about Indian customs and so forth and so on. And there's a lot he would tell me, and there's a lot he wouldn't. And, you know, and he started to mention a Native American church. And I says, oh, well, what does it believe in? What kind of church is it? And he said, no, sorry. You know, Native Americans are very secretive. The only way we got some of this information is from what might commonly be referred to as half-breeds, or people that were sympathetic to both the white man and the Indian, and were accepted in Indian circles and also appreciated the white culture, European culture, and were able to give us some hints. But you can't even get into any, you know, some of these lodges, which I mentioned, are still active and being pursued today. You can't get into any of those ceremonies. You can't get in the door and witness them. They won't let you. So they will perform some stuff for the public, like the Indian Colonial Degree Team does certain dances, and you have these Indian, what do you call them? I can't think of the name, but where they do all this stuff for the public.
Yeah, powwows.
Huh?
A powwow, I believe it's called.
Yeah, a powwow. I just couldn't think of the word. They're not revealing to you the underlying stuff. They're just showing you some of their dances and culture without revealing their innermost feelings and their the character of their society and what it believes, and how it acts out that belief. They're giving you a tease. A powwow is basically a tease, but then you're not going to get all this stuff, and we can't. Many have tried, and we just can't penetrate the secretive barrier. So we're not going to get carbon dating and all that stuff because they're not going to let us. Plain and simple. So we get what we can get, and with the rest of it, we have to use our educated brains and try to figure out some basis of which this could make sense in the grand scheme of things. Okay. What else? Yep.
Brother asks, these lodges that you spoke that very few allowed females as well as males entry into these ceremonies. Is that because these tribes had both male and female leaders, or priestesses and priests, or do we think these tribes were more co-ed in their leadership structure? Could that be why they did that?
Yeah, I'm sure that some were more appreciative of women and women's rights and were co-ed, but the majority were male-dominated societies and tribes. And the chiefs were mostly always men, and the chief priests were men. And just as it is in some instances today, I mean, our Freemasonry is all basically all men. I know there's some women Freemasonry around, and I don't want to put them down, but we're still dealing with a male dominated fraternal society, and maybe that's not good, but that's where it is. I think that the one instance that I found the women were participating, it was a pretty innocuous society. And not only were these societies brotherhoods, but they also, some of them taught, they were spiritual societies, which gave the members some sacred powers. Or they were medicine societies that gave their members special healing powers. And those kind of powers were generally not allowed to be given to women.
Interesting.
And I don't have all the answers, guys. I mean, you know, this is a fascinating study, but you could get buried in it forever because there's much to learn. There's so much to learn that it's mind-boggling. But when I see something that mirrors Freemasonry, I think to myself, wow, how could this occur separately if it did? And if it didn't, what's the bridge we can point to where they might have gotten this from? If they got this sacred shell, why didn't the rest of the American tribes, the tribes in Texas, or, you know, the Cherokees, or some of the others, why didn't they have the same shell? Why didn't they have the same ceremonies? Why is this just in a certain area? I don't know. Maybe they did. I mean, I haven't explored every Indian tribe. There are literally a lot of Indian tribes, a whole bunch. And, you know, as you get separated one from the other, you develop customs that change. And although you might have started out in the same family, you become divergent over time, you know?
It seems like from the tribes you spoke on were mostly northern, mid-east, down the East Coast. Maybe I'm not an anthropologist, but I play one on TV. And it seems like maybe it's just as a coherent group through there. I mean, that might explain why it didn't get all the way down to Texas if the migration patterns didn't get all the way down to Texas. Maybe they could be just offshoots of one far ancient, more ancient ritual that grew over the years, much in the same way Freemasonry did.
Right. And maybe it's something that came either over from Russia, over Alaska, and headed eastward, or came from Iceland to Newfoundland to Canada. But those would be basically maybe not even European. Maybe. But I don't know. I mean, there's no there's no mention of Jesus Christ or the Christian religion until much after Europeans had settled in the United States and Canada. Yet we have this ceremony coming through at a much earlier date, and you would think that if someone was to come through and teach this to the Indians, this kind of ceremony, they'd also try to bring their Christian religion with them and try to convert the Indians, which they did at a later time, but much later, you know. So I don't know. I'm not claiming that I have all the answers, and I'm not claiming that I'm 100% sure I'm right, but it just seems to me that 950 AD is a little bit before anybody touched down here. The only thing we have is the, you know, about the Westford Knight.
The knight that was carved in the rock in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah, on the road in Westford, Massachusetts, and that was early, but I think that was after the year 1000, if I'm not mistaken.
Our neighbors to the south also have the Newport Lighthouse, which they swear up and down was built by Vikings.
Yeah, who knows what cultures visited the United States long before the Europeans and left or got died out or whatever. Who knows who was here and blended in, intermarried with the Indians, and then created another whole culture, sort of mingled. I don't know who was here in 950 AD. I have no idea, but I bet there was darn few people here but Native American Indians.
I think I have one or two past masters that I could ask.
Who wants to ask what?
I think I have one or two past masters that might have been around that I could ask.
And that's the way we've got it, because we always did it that way. That's the way we got to do it.
Absolutely.
So I've had a fine time here, and we're getting close to, excuse me for a minute. We're getting close to closing. Is there any remarks somebody would like to make, or to wrap this up? Any last remarks?
I think all we have to say is thanks for coming to the setting, Maul. It was enlightening, and I'm sure there's a brother out there in internet land who's going to do a little bit of research, and when he does, bring your work down to settingmaul.com and Phoenixmasonry, and then we can do part 2 in the future.
Maybe he'll prove me wrong. Maybe my conclusions are all wet. I don't know, but we will see. Okay, brother, and it's been a pleasure being with you. And that's all for now. This is Frederic L. Milliken, parting on the square. Pots.